In 532 AD, the ancient Roman walls of Autumn trembled under Frankish siege engines as the GoodKnight, in his silver armor, stood with King Godamar's desperate defenders, knowing this battle would decide whether the last flame of Burgundian independence would flicker out forever or burn bright enough to inspire legends. As brothers Childebert and Clotaire brought 8,000 warriors to crush the final stronghold, standing between them and total dominion over Gaul, this wasn't just another territorial conquest. It was the death rattle of a kingdom that had defied Rome, survived the barbarian migrations, and carved out a century of freedom in the chaos of the post-imperial world. Watch as our immortal knight witnesses the brutal mathematics of siege warfare, where courage meets overwhelming odds, where ancient stones built by Roman hands face the methodical destruction of Frankish war machines, and where every day of resistance costs blood that can never be repaid. From the desperate night raids that turned siege engines into funeral pyres, to the final assault through morning mist that would write the epitaph of Burgundian dreams, every moment of this epic siege shaped the destiny of medieval Europe while testing the limits of human endurance. Subscribe to the GoodKnight stories for more immersive historical journeys that transport you to history's most pivotal moments, where our eternal silver-armored knight guides you through the rise and fall of kingdoms with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which forgotten siege or last stand you'd like the GoodKnight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that fateful spring of 532 AD, when the walls of Autumn became the stage for one of history's most heroic and heartbreaking final acts. The GoodKnight Stories, The Silver Night of Autumn, A Tale of the Last Stand. Chapter 1, The Weight of Silver. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Autumn like the breath of ghosts, and the GoodKnight felt their presence in every step his destrier took along the Roman road. His silver armor caught what little light filtered through the grey dawn, each plate polished to a mirror's gleam, despite the long march from the eastern borders. The metal sang softly with each movement, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat over the centuries of war. He had seen this before, the way a city holds its breath when death approaches, the way the very air seems to thicken with the weight of coming sorrow. Autumn, with its towering walls built by Roman hands 3 centuries past, stood defiant against the horizon. But the GoodKnight could taste the fear that drifted on the wind like smoke from a dying fire. Behind him, the Burgundian column stretched back into the mist, men whose grandfathers had carved this kingdom from the bones of the Western Empire, now marching to defend what might be their final stronghold. Their shields bore the marks of hasty repair, their spear points gleamed with fresh sharpening, and their faces carried the grim determination of warriors who knew they walked toward either glory or the grave. The GoodKnight's thoughts turned, as they often did in these quiet moments before battle, to the strange currents of fate that had brought him here. He had stood with Romans against barbarians, with barbarians against Romans, with Christians against pagans, and pagans against Christians. He had watched empires rise and crumble, had seen kings crowned and buried, had witnessed the slow transformation of the world from one age to another. Yet here he was again, silver armor gleaming, ready to stand with brave men against impossible odds. King Godomar rode at the head of the column, his broad shoulders set with the weight of a crown that grew heavier with each passing day. The good knight had served under many kings, but few carried their burden with such quiet dignity. Godomar's kingdom was dying, had been dying since the Franks first crossed their borders 9 years ago. Yet still he rode to war with the bearing of a man who believed in tomorrow. The sound of hoofbeats on stone echoed off the walls as they approached Autumn's gates. The city had been old when Rome was young, had been a center of learning and trade when the Aedui ruled these lands. Now it would serve as the stage for what might be the final act of Burgundian independence. The good knight could see the defenders lining the walls, men with weathered faces and steady hands, citizens who had taken up arms alongside professional soldiers, all united by the knowledge that their world hung in the balance. As they passed through the gates, the good knight noticed the way the morning light played across the ancient stones, how the shadows seemed deeper than they should be, how the very air seemed to whisper of endings. He had learned, over his long years of war, to read these signs. The city was beautiful in the way that doomed things often are, possessed of a terrible, fragile dignity that made the heart ache with the knowledge of what was to come. The streets of Autumn were narrow and winding, built in the Roman fashion but softened by centuries of Burgundian habitation. Children peered from doorways with wide eyes, their mothers pulling them back into the safety of shadows. Old men stood in small groups, speaking in low voices about the approaching storm. The good knight had seen this tableau played out in 100 cities, in a dozen kingdoms across the span of centuries. The details changed, the faces, the language, the banners, but the essence remained the same. People facing the unknown, clinging to hope while preparing for the worst. They made their way to the central square, where the old Roman Forum had been converted into a marketplace. Here, King Godomar would address his people, would speak words of courage and defiance that would echo in their hearts long after the battle was done. The good knight dismounted, his silver sabatons ringing against the worn stones, and took his place among the king's guard. The crowd gathered slowly, drawn by the sound of horns and the sight of their king in his war gear. They came from every corner of the city, merchants and craftsmen, farmers who had fled from the countryside, priests and scholars, young men eager for glory, and old men who remembered the last time the Franks had come. The good knight studied their faces, seeing in them the same mixture of fear and determination he had witnessed in countless other places. At countless other times, King Godomar stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "My people," he began, and the good knight heard in those simple words the weight of a kingdom's history. The Franks come again to our lands, as they have come before. They bring with them the promise of conquest, the threat of subjugation, the dream of empire. But we are not Rome, to fall at the first assault. We are not some barbarian tribe, to scatter at the sight of their banners. We are Burgundians, and this is our land. The crowd stirred, a murmur of approval rippling through the assembled masses. The good knight had heard such speeches before, had seen how words could transform frightened civilians into determined defenders. Yet there was something different in Godomar's voice, something that spoke not just of defiance but of a deeper understanding. This king knew what was coming. He knew the odds they faced, knew the strength of their enemies, knew the weakness of their own position, and still he chose to fight. The Franks believe that might makes right. Godomar continued, his voice growing stronger. They believe that because they are many, we must bow. Because they are strong, we must yield. Because they are united under their brother kings, we must surrender our freedom. But I say to you, strength is not measured only in numbers. Unity is not found only in conquest. And freedom is worth any price. The good knight felt the familiar stirring in his chest, the same feeling that had driven him to take up arms in 100 different causes across the centuries. It was not loyalty to any particular king or kingdom that moved him, but something deeper, a recognition of the eternal struggle between those who would dominate and those who would remain free. He had stood with the weak against the strong so many times that it had become as natural as breathing. As the king spoke, the good knight's eyes wandered to the walls of the city, studying the ancient fortifications that would soon be tested by Frankish siege engines. The walls were strong, built of massive stone blocks fitted together with Roman precision, but they had been built for a different kind of war. The Franks who approached were not the same as the barbarian raiders who had threatened Autumn in centuries past. These were organized, disciplined, led by kings who understood both war and statecraft. They would not simply throw themselves against the walls in wild charges. They would probe for weaknesses, would use cunning as well as strength, would be patient in their pursuit of victory. The thought brought no despair to the good knight's heart, only a familiar sense of anticipation. He had faced impossible odds before, had stood in the breach when all seemed lost, had found in desperate moments the kind of clarity that comes only when everything is at stake. Win or lose, he would give his all to this fight, as he had given his all to every fight that had come before. King Godomar's speech was drawing to a close, his final words ringing out across the square like a battle cry. "Let the Franks come," he declared. "Let them bring their armies, their siege engines, their dreams of conquest. They will find us ready. They will find us united. They will find us Burgundian." The crowd erupted in cheers, voices raised in defiance and determination. The good knight felt the familiar surge of emotion that came at such moments. Part sorrow for what was to come, part pride in the courage of mortal men, part anticipation for the test that lay ahead. He had learned long ago not to question the strange fate that brought him to these moments, but simply to embrace them with all the strength and skill he possessed. As the crowd began to disperse, each person returning to their preparations for siege, the good knight remained in the square, his silver armor gleaming in the strengthening sunlight. He could feel the weight of history pressing down upon this place, could sense the convergence of forces that would soon transform this ancient city into a battlefield. Somewhere to the north, the Frankish armies were marching, led by brother kings who dreamed of empire. Here in Autumn, defenders prepared to make their stand, knowing that defeat might mean the end of everything they held dear. The good knight closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of the city. The ring of hammers on metal as weapons were sharpened, the creak of cart wheels as supplies were moved, the low murmur of voices as plans were made and prayers were offered. These were the sounds of a people preparing for war, sounds he had heard in 100 different places, in a dozen different languages, across the span of centuries. Yet each time they moved him in the same way, reminding him of the courage that dwelt in mortal hearts, the willingness to stand and fight even when the outcome was uncertain. When he opened his eyes again, the sun had climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the city in all its ancient glory. Autumn stood ready for siege, its walls manned, its gates barred, its people united in defiance. Whatever came next, the GoodKnight would be ready to meet it, his silver armor gleaming, his sword sharp, his heart prepared for whatever fate the gods of war might decree. 3 days passed in the strange, suspended time that comes before battle, hours that stretch like years, filled with the endless small preparations that transform a city into a fortress. The GoodKnight spent these days walking the walls of Autumn, studying every stone, every angle, every potential weakness that Frankish eyes might exploit. His silver armor had become a familiar sight to the defenders, a gleaming constant that seemed to embody their determination to stand firm against the coming storm. The walls themselves told the story of centuries. Roman engineers had built them to last, massive blocks of local stone fitted together with mathematical precision. But time and weather had taken their toll, and the GoodKnight could see where Burgundian masons had made repairs over the decades, patches of newer stone that stood out like scars against the ancient masonry. These repairs were solid enough, but they represented potential points of failure, places where a determined enemy might concentrate their efforts. From the eastern wall, the GoodKnight could see the road that led toward Frankish territory, the same road he had traveled so many times in his long existence. It wound through rolling hills covered in oak and beech forests, past abandoned Roman villas whose owners had fled or died in the chaos of the empire's collapse. Somewhere beyond those hills, the armies of Childebert and Clothar were marching, their banners bright in the spring sunshine, their hearts filled with dreams of conquest and glory. The defenders of Autumn numbered perhaps 3,000 men, a mixture of professional soldiers, local militia, and volunteers who had never held a weapon in anger before this crisis. The GoodKnight had seen them training in the courtyards and squares, watched as grizzled veterans tried to teach farmers and craftsmen the basics of shield wall tactics and spear work. It was heartening to see their determination, but he knew that courage alone would not be enough against the disciplined Frankish war machine. King Godomar had established his headquarters in the old Roman basilica, its soaring columns and marble floors now serving as a war room where maps were spread and strategies debated. The GoodKnight often found himself there in the evenings, listening as the king and his advisors discussed their options. The conversations were always the same. How long could they hold the walls? What were the chances of relief from their Ostrogothic allies? Whether it might be better to sally forth and meet the Franks in open battle rather than endure a siege. The GoodKnight knew the answers to these questions, had lived through similar situations countless times before. The walls would hold for a while, but not forever. No relief would come. The Ostrogoths were too busy with their own succession crisis to spare troops for Burgundy, and a sally against the combined armies of two Frankish kings would be nothing short of suicide. Yet he said nothing, understanding that these men needed to explore every possibility, needed to convince themselves that they had considered every option before accepting the grim reality of their situation. On the morning of the fourth day, the scouts brought word that the Frankish vanguard had been sighted. The GoodKnight was on the eastern wall when the first enemy riders appeared on the distant hills, their spear points glinting like stars in the morning light. They came slowly, deliberately, making no attempt at concealment. This was not a raid or a surprise attack. This was the methodical approach of a professional army that knew its own strength and felt no need for stealth. The defenders watched in tense silence as more and more Frankish warriors appeared on the horizon. They came in ordered columns, their shields painted in the bright colors of their various tribes and war bands, their banners snapping in the spring breeze. The GoodKnight could make out the different contingents: Salian Franks from the north with their distinctive long shields, Ripuarian Franks from the Rhine with their elaborate helmet crests, and mixed groups of allied Germanic tribes who had thrown in their lot with the Merovingian kings. By midday, the entire Frankish army had deployed on the plain before Autumn's walls. The GoodKnight estimated their numbers at perhaps 8,000 men. Not an enormous force by the standards of later ages, but more than enough to overwhelm the city's defenders if properly employed. They made their camp with the efficiency of veterans, digging earthworks and setting up their tents in neat rows, establishing a perimeter that spoke of long experience in siege warfare. The two Frankish kings established their pavilions on a low hill that commanded a clear view of the city. Even at this distance, the GoodKnight could see the royal banners fluttering above the elaborate tents, the golden lilies of Childebert and the silver eagles of Clotha. These were not barbarian chieftains leading wild war bands, but sophisticated rulers who understood both the art of war and the science of statecraft. They would not be rushed into hasty assaults or foolish gestures. They would take their time, probe for weaknesses, and strike only when they were certain of success. As the afternoon wore on, small groups of Frankish warriors began to approach the walls, staying just out of arrow range as they studied the fortifications. The GoodKnight watched them through the gaps in the battlements, noting their equipment and bearing. These were professional soldiers, men who had spent their lives learning the craft of war. Their shields were well maintained, their weapons sharp, their movements disciplined. They pointed at various sections of the wall, discussing what they saw in low voices, making mental notes that would be reported back to their commanders. The psychological effect of this careful reconnaissance was not lost on the defenders. The GoodKnight could see the tension in their faces, the way their hands tightened on their weapons as they watched the enemy studying their defenses. It was one thing to prepare for battle in the abstract, quite another to see your enemies with your own eyes, to watch them planning your destruction with calm professionalism. As evening approached, the Frankish army settled into the routine of siege warfare. Cooking fires began to twinkle across their camp like earthbound stars, and the sound of voices and laughter drifted across the plain. The good knight found this almost more unsettling than open hostility. The casual confidence of men who knew they held all the advantages, who could afford to be patient because time was on their side. That night, King Godomar called a council of war in the basilica. The good knight stood with the other senior commanders as maps were unrolled, and the situation was discussed in frank terms. The king's face was grave but composed, showing none of the desperation that must have been eating at his heart. "They will not assault immediately," Godomar said, his finger tracing the Frankish positions on the map. "They are too professional for that. They will probe our defenses, look for weak points, perhaps try to starve us out. We must be ready for a long siege." One of his advisors, an old warrior named Sigismund, who had fought in the previous war against the Franks, shook his head grimly. "My lord, our supplies will not last more than a month, perhaps 6 weeks if we ration strictly. And if they bring up siege engines, then we must make every day cost them dearly," Godomar replied. "Every assault they make must be so bloody that they question whether the prize is worth the price. We cannot match their numbers, but we can make them pay for every stone of these walls." The good knight listened to the discussion with the detached interest of one who had heard similar conversations many times before. The mathematics of siege warfare were always the same: time, supplies, morale, and casualties. The defenders had the advantage of strong walls and interior lines, but they were outnumbered and cut off from resupply. The attackers had superior numbers and resources, but they faced the difficult task of taking a fortified position defended by desperate men. As the council broke up and the commanders dispersed to their various duties, the good knight found himself alone with King Godomar. The two men stood in silence for a moment, studying the map that showed their precarious situation in stark detail. "You have seen this before?" Godomar said finally. It was not a question. The good knight nodded slowly. "Many times, my lord. In many places." "And how does it usually end?" The good knight considered his answer carefully. He could offer false hope, could speak of miraculous victories and last-minute rescues. But this king deserved honesty, deserved to face his fate with clear eyes. "It ends as it must end," he said finally. "With courage or cowardice, with honor or shame, with glory or ignominy. The outcome may be predetermined, but how we meet it, that is always our choice." Godomar smiled, an expression both sad and proud. "Then we shall meet it well, you and I. Whatever comes, we shall meet it as Burgundians." The good knight bowed his head in acknowledgement. He had served many kings, had sworn many oaths, had fought for many causes. But in this moment, he felt the familiar stirring of loyalty that came when he recognized true nobility of spirit. Win or lose, he would stand with this king until the end. Outside, the night was clear and cold, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The good knight made his rounds of the walls, checking on the sentries, studying the enemy camp, listening to the sounds of the night. Somewhere in the darkness, owls called to each other across the ancient stones, their voices carrying a note of melancholy that seemed to echo the mood of the besieged city. From the eastern wall, he could see the glow of the Frankish campfires, could hear the distant sound of voices, and the occasional whinny of horses. The enemy was settling in for a long siege, confident in their superior numbers and resources. They could afford to be patient, could wait for hunger and despair to do their work for them. But the GoodKnight had learned long ago that patience was a weapon that cut both ways. Yes, time favored the attackers in this case, but it also gave the defenders opportunities, chances to strike back, to disrupt enemy plans, to show that the walls of Autumn would not fall without a fight. The siege had barely begun, and already he was thinking of ways to make the Franks pay for their confidence. As he completed his circuit of the walls, the GoodKnight paused at the southern gate, where a small shrine to St. Martin had been built into the stonework. The saint's carved face looked out over the city with an expression of serene compassion, as if offering comfort to all who sought his protection. The GoodKnight was not a particularly religious man. His long existence had given him a complicated relationship with matters of faith, but he found something comforting in the saint's presence, a reminder that some things endured even when kingdoms fell. He knelt briefly before the shrine, not in prayer, but in acknowledgement of the courage that faith could inspire in mortal hearts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of strength and will. The Franks would begin their work in earnest, probing the defenses, testing the resolve of the defenders, looking for the cracks that would allow them to break through. But tonight, Autumn still stood free. Tonight, the Silver Knight kept his vigil on the ancient walls, ready to face whatever dawn might bring. Dawn came gray and cold, with a mist that clung to the valley floor like the breath of sleeping giants. The GoodKnight had not slept. Sleep was a luxury he had learned to do without during sieges, but had spent the night hours in meditation, preparing his mind and spirit for the trials to come. From his position on the eastern wall, he watched as the Frankish camp stirred to life, cooking fires, sending thin columns of smoke into the pale sky. The enemy moved with the practiced efficiency of veterans. The GoodKnight could see work parties heading out to the nearby forests, returning with timber that would be shaped into siege engines. Other groups were digging trenches and building earthworks, creating a network of fortifications that would protect their camp and provide covered approaches to the city walls. This was not the hasty preparation of raiders, but the methodical work of professional soldiers who understood that sieges were won through patience and engineering as much as courage and steel. By mid-morning, the first Frankish delegation approached under a banner of truce. The GoodKnight watched from the walls as 3 riders made their way across the plain, their horses stepping carefully through the morning dew. The lead rider bore the royal arms of Childebert, his armor gleaming in the strengthening sunlight, his bearing that of a man accustomed to command. King Godemar met the delegation at the main gate, flanked by his senior commanders. The GoodKnight positioned himself where he could hear the exchange, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. He had witnessed many such parleys over the centuries, and they followed a predictable pattern: demands for surrender, offers of clemency, threats of what would happen if the city continued to resist. The Frankish herald was a tall man with graying hair and intelligent eyes, clearly chosen for his diplomatic skills as much as his military bearing. He spoke in the formal Latin that was still used for such occasions, his words carrying clearly in the still morning air. Godemar, king of the Burgundians, he began, his voice respectful but firm. I bring greetings from their royal majesties Childebert, king of Paris, and Clothar, king of Soissons. They offer you terms of surrender that are both generous and honorable. Godemar stood silent for a moment, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. The good knight had seen this same scene played out countless times, the moment when a ruler must choose between the certainty of defeat and the slim hope of victory, between the safety of submission and the honor of resistance. Speak your terms, Godemar said finally. The herald nodded and began to recite what were clearly prepared words. Submit now, and your people will be spared. Your nobles may keep their lands if they swear fealty to the Frankish crown. Your soldiers may join our armies with honor. Your merchants and craftsmen may continue their trades under our protection. The city of Autumn will not be sacked. Its treasures will not be plundered. Its women and children will not be harmed. The terms were indeed generous by the standards of the age. The good knight had seen cities that resisted suffer far worse fates, populations enslaved, buildings burned, entire cultures erased from the earth. The Frankish kings were offering Godemar a chance to save his people, even if it meant the end of Burgundian independence. And what of me? Godemar asked quietly. The herald's expression grew more serious. You will be granted lands in Francia, a place of honor at court, the respect due to a king who chose wisdom over pride. Your line will continue. Your name will be remembered with honor. It was a golden cage they offered, but a cage nonetheless. The good knight could see the struggle in Godemar's face, the weight of responsibility for his people warring with his duty to preserve their freedom. This was the terrible burden of kingship, to make choices that would echo through generations, to balance the immediate welfare of subjects against the long-term survival of a nation. Godemar was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from the herald to his own commanders, then up to the walls where his soldiers waited for his decision. The good knight could feel the tension in the air, could sense the collective held breath of an entire city waiting to learn its fate. Your kings are generous, Godemar said finally. But Burgundy has stood free for more than a century. My father died defending these lands, as did his father before him. I will not be the king who surrenders what they died to preserve. The herald nodded, as if he had expected this answer. Then you choose the hard path, my lord. I pray you do not come to regret it. I regret many things, Godemar replied, but I will not regret standing for my people's freedom. The delegation withdrew, their horses' hooves echoing on the stone bridge that spanned the small river protecting autumn's eastern approach. The good knight watched them go, knowing that the last chance for a peaceful resolution had just vanished into the morning mist. From this moment forward, there would be only war. The Frankish response was swift and professional. Within hours, work parties were felling trees and shaping timber, the sound of axes and saws echoing across the valley. The good knight could see the skeleton of a siege tower beginning to take shape, its frame rising like the bones of some enormous beast. Other groups were constructing mangonels and ballistae, the great engines of war that would soon begin hurling stones and bolts at autumn's ancient walls. But the Franks were not content to simply build their engines in safety. As the afternoon wore on, groups of warriors began to probe the city's defenses, testing the alertness of the sentries and looking for weak points in the fortifications. These were not serious attacks, but rather reconnaissance in force, designed to gather information while keeping the defenders on edge. The first real clash came just before sunset. A group of perhaps 50 Frankish warriors approached the eastern gate under cover of a supply wagon, hoping to get close enough to examine the gate's construction. The GoodKnight was on the wall above when he spotted the deception. The way the men moved, the suspicious bulk of the wagon, the glint of hidden weapons. "Archers!" he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Target the wagon!" The Burgundian bowmen responded instantly, their arrows whistling down from the walls like deadly rain. The Frankish warriors scattered, abandoning their wagon and racing back toward their own lines. But they had moved too late. Several men fell, their blood dark against the pale stones of the approach road. The wagon itself proved to contain not supplies, but a ram, its iron head designed to batter down the gate. The GoodKnight smiled grimly as he watched the Franks retreat. It had been a clever plan, but not clever enough. The enemy would have to try harder if they hoped to catch the defenders off guard. The skirmish was small, lasting only minutes, but its psychological impact was significant. The defenders had drawn first blood, had shown that they would not be passive victims waiting for slaughter. The GoodKnight could see the effect on the men around him. Straighter backs, steadier hands, eyes bright with the confidence that comes from successful action. But he also knew that this was only the beginning. The Franks had tested the defenses and found them alert. Now they would settle in for the long, grinding work of siege warfare, using their superior numbers and resources to slowly wear down the defenders' strength and morale. As night fell, the GoodKnight made his rounds of the walls, checking on the sentries and studying the enemy positions. The Frankish camp was a constellation of fires in the darkness, each one representing dozens of warriors who would soon be trying to break through these ancient stones. The sight should have been daunting, but the GoodKnight found it oddly comforting. He had faced worse odds before, had stood on walls that seemed just as hopeless, had found victory in situations that appeared impossible. The key, he had learned, was not to think about the final outcome, but to focus on the immediate task. Tonight, that task was to keep watch, to ensure that the Franks did not attempt a night assault or try to undermine the walls under cover of darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities to strike back at the enemy. From somewhere in the city below, he could hear the sound of singing. A group of soldiers around a fire, their voices raised in an old Burgundian war song. The melody was haunting, filled with the melancholy that seemed to characterize all the music of this people. It spoke of heroes long dead, of battles fought in distant times, of the eternal struggle between freedom and tyranny. The GoodKnight found himself humming along, the words coming back to him from some half-remembered campaign decades ago. He had fought alongside Burgundians before, had learned to appreciate their fierce independence and their stubborn courage. They were not the most numerous of peoples, nor the most wealthy, but they possessed something that could not be bought or conquered: a spirit that refused to bow, even in the face of overwhelming odds. A movement in the enemy camp caught his attention, and he focused his gaze on a group of Frankish warriors who were moving towards the city under cover of darkness. They carried no torches, made no sound, but the GoodKnight's experienced eyes could track their progress by the way they blocked out the stars. This was a serious probe, perhaps 50 men hoping to scale the walls or find an unguarded postern gate. He moved silently along the wall, alerting the sentries with hand signals rather than spoken words. The defenders readied their weapons, arrows nocked and spears lowered, waiting for the enemy to come within range. The GoodKnight drew his own sword, the blade whispering from its sheath like a prayer for the dead. The Franks reached the base of the wall and began to climb, using ropes and grappling hooks to scale the ancient stones. They moved with practiced skill, but they had not counted on the alertness of the defenders. As the first enemy warrior appeared at the top of the wall, the GoodKnight was waiting for him. The fight was brief, but vicious. The Frankish warrior was skilled and brave, his seax flashing in the starlight as he tried to carve out a foothold on the wall. But the GoodKnight had centuries of experience behind every move, and his silver blade found its mark with surgical precision. The enemy fell back into the darkness, his cry of pain echoing off the stones. More Franks appeared along the wall, and the battle spread as defenders rushed to meet them. Steel rang against steel in the darkness. Men grunted and cursed as they fought for their lives on the narrow walkway. The GoodKnight moved like a silver ghost among the combatants, his blade weaving patterns of death in the starlight. The assault lasted perhaps 20 minutes before the surviving Franks retreated, leaving their dead behind on the walls of autumn. The GoodKnight counted 8 enemy bodies, while the defenders had lost only 2 men. It was a small victory, but victories were precious things in a siege, to be treasured and remembered when darker times came. As dawn approached, the GoodKnight stood among the bodies of the fallen, his silver armor stained with blood that looked black in the pre-dawn light. The first day of the siege was ending as it had begun, with death and defiance, with courage and calculation, with the eternal dance of war that he had witnessed in 100 different times and places. But this was only the beginning. The real test was yet to come. The second week of the siege brought with it the deep, rhythmic pounding that would haunt the dreams of Autumn's defenders for the rest of their lives, however long those lives might prove to be. The Frankish siege engines had been completed, and now they began their methodical work of reducing the ancient walls to rubble. The GoodKnight stood on the eastern wall as the first stones began to fly, massive blocks of granite hurled by the great mangonels that the Franks had constructed just beyond arrow range. Each impact sent tremors through the stonework, dust cascading from the joints between the massive Roman blocks. The walls had stood for 3 centuries, had weathered countless storms and minor sieges, but they had never faced anything like this systematic bombardment. Thrum, crack, crash. The sound became as regular as a heartbeat, marking time in a city where time itself seemed suspended between hope and despair. The GoodKnight watched as one particularly large stone struck the wall perhaps 20 feet to his left, sending chips of ancient masonry flying like deadly rain. The impact left a crater in the stone, not deep enough to breach the wall, but significant enough to show that the Frankish engineers knew their craft. The defenders had not been idle during the construction of the siege engines. Under the GoodKnight's guidance, they had built wooden hoardings along the top of the walls, covered galleries that would protect the archers and spearmen from the rain of stones and bolts. They had also prepared cauldrons of oil and pitch, ready to pour down on any attackers who managed to reach the base of the walls. But the GoodKnight knew that passive defense would not be enough. The mathematics of siege warfare were inexorable. Given enough time and ammunition, the Frankish engines would eventually breach the walls. The defenders needed to strike back, to disrupt the enemy's plans and buy precious time. The opportunity came on the 10th day of the bombardment. The GoodKnight had been studying the Frankish positions, noting the patterns of their guards and the routines of their work parties. The siege engines were protected by earthworks and palisades, but they were not impregnable. A small, determined force might be able to reach them under cover of darkness and do significant damage. King Godamar was initially reluctant to approve the sortie. "We cannot afford to lose men in futile gestures," he said when the GoodKnight presented his plan. "Every warrior we have may be needed for the final defense." "My lord," the GoodKnight replied, his voice calm but insistent, "if we do nothing, there will be no final defense. Those engines will bring down the walls within a month. We must act while we still have the strength to do so." The king studied the crude map they had drawn of the Frankish positions, his finger tracing the proposed route of attack. The plan was audacious. 50 men would slip out through a postern gate on the western side of the city, circle around through the forest, and strike at the siege engines from an unexpected direction. It was dangerous, perhaps even suicidal, but it offered the only real chance of disrupting the enemy's methodical destruction of the walls. "Who will lead this attack?" Godamar asked. The GoodKnight met his gaze steadily. "I will, my lord." The sortie was planned for the darkest hour before dawn, when the Frankish sentries would be at their least alert. The GoodKnight selected his men carefully, veterans who could move silently and fight fiercely, men who understood that they might not return from this mission. They blackened their armor and weapons to prevent reflections, wrapped their feet in cloth to muffle their footsteps, and prepared bundles of oil-soaked rags that could be used to set fire to the wooden siege engines. The postern gate opened silently on well-oiled hinges, and the raiders slipped out into the night like ghosts. The GoodKnight led them through the narrow streets of the lower city, past houses where families huddled in their beds, listening to the distant sound of the bombardment. The Silver Knight's armor had been dulled with mud and ash, but it still caught occasional glints of starlight as he moved through the shadows. The forest beyond the city walls was thick with oak and beech, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. The GoodKnight moved through the undergrowth with the silent grace of a hunter, his men following in single file behind him. They had practiced this route during the daylight hours, memorizing every fallen log and hidden stream that might betray their presence. The Frankish camp was a maze of tents and earthworks, lit by scattered watchfires that cast dancing shadows across the ground. The GoodKnight could hear the low murmur of conversation from the sentries, the occasional whinny of horses, the distant sound of someone singing a drinking song. The enemy was confident, perhaps overconfident, secure in their superior numbers and the protection of their fortifications. The siege engines loomed against the night sky like sleeping monsters, their wooden frames dark and angular. The GoodKnight counted 3 mangonels and 2 ballistae, all positioned to concentrate their fire on the eastern wall, where the bombardment had already begun to show effect. Guards patrolled around the engines, but their attention was focused outward, toward the city they were besieging, not inward toward their own camp. The GoodKnight signaled to his men, and they spread out in a wide arc around the siege engines. Each man carried a specific assignment. Some would attack the guards, others would set fires, still others would use axes and hammers to damage the wooden mechanisms. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution, but the GoodKnight had confidence in his chosen warriors. The attack began with a flight of arrows from the darkness, silent death that struck down the outer sentries before they could raise an alarm. The GoodKnight himself led the charge against the nearest mangonel, his sword cutting down a surprised guard who had barely time to draw his weapon. Behind him, his men swarmed over the siege engine like ants, their axes biting deep into the wooden frame. The alarm was raised within minutes, horns blowing across the Frankish camp as warriors stumbled from their tents and rushed toward the sound of battle. But the raiders had done their work well. 2 of the mangonels were already burning, their wooden frames crackling as the flames spread. The 3rd engine had been damaged beyond immediate repair, its throwing arm hacked through at the crucial joint. "Fall back!" The GoodKnight called out, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of combat. "The job is done." The retreat was almost as dangerous as the attack had been. Frankish warriors poured out of their camp in pursuit, their torches bobbing through the forest like angry fireflies. The GoodKnight and his men ran through the darkness, using their knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of their pursuers. Arrows whistled past them, and once a thrown spear nearly took down one of the raiders, but they managed to reach the postern gate with only minor casualties. The gates of autumn opened to receive them, and the raiders stumbled inside to the cheers of the defenders who had watched the distant fires with growing excitement. The GoodKnight counted his men as they passed through the gate. 47 of the 50 who had set out, with only minor wounds among the survivors. It was a remarkable success by any measure. King Godomar was waiting in the courtyard, his face showing a mixture of relief and admiration. "Well done," he said simply, but the GoodKnight could hear the deeper emotion in those 2 words. The sortie had been more than a military success. It had been a statement of defiance, a declaration that the defenders of autumn would not go quietly into the night. The bombardment resumed the next day, but with noticeably less intensity. The Franks had lost 2 of their 5 siege engines, and the 3rd was still being repaired. More importantly, they had learned that the defenders were not content to simply wait behind their walls. The Frankish camp was now ringed with additional sentries, and work parties moved with greater caution. But the GoodKnight knew that the respite would be temporary. The Franks had the resources to build new engines, and they would certainly do so. The sortie had bought time, perhaps a few weeks, but it had not changed the fundamental mathematics of the siege. Autumn was still outnumbered, still cut off from outside help, still facing an enemy with superior resources and unlimited patience. The psychological effect of the raid, however, was significant. The good knight could see it in the faces of the defenders as he made his rounds of the walls. Straighter backs, steadier hands, eyes bright with renewed confidence. They had struck back at their enemies, had shown that they were not helpless victims waiting for slaughter. It was a small victory, but in a siege, small victories could mean the difference between hope and despair. The Frankish response came 3 days later, in the form of a massive assault on the eastern wall. The good knight watched from the battlements as thousands of enemy warriors formed up in the pre-dawn darkness, their shields locked together in the classic testudo formation. They came forward slowly, methodically, protected by the remaining siege engines and covered by flights of arrows from Frankish archers. The assault began with a thunderous crash as the first wave of attackers struck the wall. Ladders appeared as if by magic, their tops crowned with steel as Frankish warriors began to climb. The good knight drew his sword and moved to meet them, his silver blade flashing in the morning light as he cut down the first enemy warrior to reach the top of the wall. The battle raged for hours, waves of Frankish attackers surging up the ladders, only to be met by the desperate resistance of the defenders. The good knight fought like a man possessed, his centuries of experience guiding every stroke of his blade. He seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing wherever the defense was weakest, rallying the defenders with his presence as much as his sword. But the Franks kept coming, their numbers seemingly inexhaustible. For every warrior who fell, 2 more took his place. The good knight could see the strain beginning to tell on the defenders, men stumbling with exhaustion, wounds going untreated, gaps appearing in the line that had to be filled by reserves who were already stretched thin. The crisis came when a group of Frankish warriors managed to establish a foothold on the wall near the eastern gate. They fought with desperate courage, knowing that their success might open the way for their comrades below. The good knight rushed to meet them, but he could see that the defenders in that section were wavering, their line beginning to bend under the pressure. It was then that King Godamar himself appeared on the wall, his royal sword gleaming as he led a countercharge against the Frankish foothold. The sight of their king fighting beside them galvanized the defenders, and they surged forward with renewed vigor. The Frankish warriors were pushed back, their foothold eliminated, their ladders cast down into the courtyard below. The assault finally broke just after midday, the surviving Frankish warriors retreating to their camp to lick their wounds and count their losses. The good knight stood among the bodies of the fallen, his silver armor stained with blood and his breath coming in ragged gasps. The wall had held, but barely, and he knew that the next assault might not be so easily repelled. The cost had been terrible. Nearly 100 defenders lay dead or wounded, men who could not be replaced. The good knight looked out over the Frankish camp and saw that they were already preparing for another assault, their engineers working to repair the damaged siege engines while their commanders planned new tactics. The siege was entering its most dangerous phase, the time when desperation would drive both sides to ever greater extremes of courage and brutality. The good knight had seen it before, had lived through the grinding horror of walls that held by inches and hours that stretched like years. He knew what was coming, knew the price that would be paid before this siege reached its inevitable conclusion. But he also knew that he would stand his ground would fight until the last stone fell or the last enemy retreated. It was what he had always done, what he would always do, as long as there were walls to defend and causes worth dying for. The Silver Knight of Autumn prepared for the trials yet to come. By the 4th week of the siege, hunger had become another enemy stalking the streets of Autumn. The good knight could see it in the faces of the defenders as he made his morning rounds. The hollow cheeks, the sunken eyes, the way their hands trembled slightly as they gripped their weapons. The city's granaries, well stocked at the beginning of the siege, were now nearly empty, their contents carefully rationed to stretch as far as possible. The smell of the city had changed, too. Where once there had been the rich aromas of bread baking and meat roasting, now there was only the thin scent of watery gruel and the underlying odor of too many people living too close together under conditions of extreme stress. The good knight had experienced this transformation many times before, had watched as proud cities slowly withered under the relentless pressure of siege warfare. King Godomar had ordered the slaughter of the remaining horses 3 days ago, their meat distributed among the defenders to provide what protein they could. The good knight's own destrier had been among them, the faithful animal that had carried him through so many battles, now reduced to strips of tough, stringy meat that barely filled the belly. It was a practical decision, but one that cut deeply. Horses were not just transportation in this age, but companions, partners in the deadly dance of war. The Frankish bombardment continued with mechanical regularity, though the enemy had learned to be more cautious after the successful raid on their siege engines. New mangonels had been constructed, positioned further from the walls and protected by elaborate earthworks. The stones they hurled were smaller now, but more numerous, a constant rain of granite that slowly but surely wore away at the ancient masonry. Thrum, crack, crash. Thrum, crack, crash. The sound had become so constant that the defenders barely noticed it anymore, except when a particularly large stone struck close enough to shower them with debris. The eastern wall now showed significant damage, with several sections reduced to half their original height. The good knight could see that it would not withstand many more weeks of this systematic destruction. But it was not just the physical damage that concerned him. The psychological toll of the siege was becoming evident in ways both subtle and obvious. Men jumped at sudden sounds, snapped at their comrades over trivial matters, stared into space with the 1,000-yard gaze that the good knight recognized from countless other sieges. The human spirit, he had learned, was remarkably resilient, but it was not infinite. Even the bravest men had their breaking point. The breaking point seemed to arrive on a grey morning in the 5th week, when a group of citizens approached the main gate with a petition for King Godomar. The good knight watched from the walls as they gathered in the courtyard, perhaps 50 men and women whose faces showed the strain of weeks under siege. Their spokesman was a merchant named Marcus, a man who had prospered under Burgundian rule and now faced the prospect of losing everything. "My lord," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "we have served you faithfully, have given our sons to your army and our wealth to your cause. But our children are starving, our stores are empty, and the walls grow weaker each day. Perhaps Perhaps it is time to consider the Frankish terms once more. The good knight could see the pain in Godamar's face as he listened to the petition. This was the moment every besieged ruler dreaded, when his own people began to question the wisdom of continued resistance. The king's response would determine not just the fate of the city, but the morale of every defender on the walls. Godamar was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from face to face among the petitioners. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "My friends, I understand your suffering. I share it. My own children go hungry, my own stores are as empty as yours. But I ask you to remember what surrender means, not just for us, but for our children and their children. The Franks offer us slavery dressed in silk, chains made of gold. Is that truly what we want for Burgundy?" An old woman in the crowd stepped forward, her back bent with age, but her eyes still bright with intelligence. "My lord, what good is freedom to the dead? What good is independence to children who starve in their mother's arms?" It was a fair question, one that cut to the heart of the moral dilemma facing every defender. The good knight had heard similar debates in a dozen different cities, had seen how the mathematics of siege warfare eventually reduced all noble ideals to simple questions of survival. How many lives was freedom worth? How much suffering could be justified in the name of independence? "Grandmother," Godamar said, using the respectful term that acknowledged her age and wisdom, "I cannot promise you that we will survive this siege. I cannot promise you that your grandchildren will live to see another spring. But I can promise you this. If we surrender now, if we bow to the Frankish yoke, then everything our fathers died for will have been in vain. Burgundy will become nothing more than a memory, a footnote in the chronicles of Frankish conquest." The crowd murmured among themselves, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in despair. The good knight could see the division among them, the way families and friends found themselves on opposite sides of an impossible choice. It was one of the cruelest aspects of siege warfare, the way it turned communities against themselves, forcing people to choose between competing loyalties and conflicting values. The debate continued for nearly an hour, voices raised in passion and desperation as the citizens of Autumn struggled with their fate. In the end, no formal decision was reached. The crowd simply dispersed, each person left to wrestle with their own conscience. But the good knight could see that the seeds of doubt had been planted, that the unity which had sustained the defense was beginning to crack under the pressure of hunger and despair. That afternoon brought news that made the situation even more desperate. A messenger had somehow slipped through the Frankish lines during the night, bringing word from the outside world. The Ostrogoths, Burgundy's last potential allies, were indeed too embroiled in their own succession crisis to provide aid. King Athalaric was dead, and the kingdom was torn between competing claimants to the throne. No help would come from that quarter. Worse still, the messenger reported that other Burgundian cities had already fallen to the Franks. Chalon-sur-Saône had surrendered after a brief siege, its walls breached by Frankish engines. Mâcon had opened its gates without a fight, its leaders choosing submission over destruction. Autumn now stood virtually alone, the last major stronghold of Burgundian independence. The news spread through the city like wildfire, carried by whispers and worried glances. The good knight could feel the change in atmosphere, the way hope seemed to drain out of the defenders like water from a broken vessel. Men who had stood firm for weeks now began to question whether their sacrifice had any meaning, whether they were dying for a cause that was already lost. It was King Godomar who rallied them, appearing on the walls that evening to address his soldiers directly. The good knight stood nearby as the king spoke, noting how the royal voice had grown hoarse from weeks of strain, but had lost none of its authority. "My warriors," Godomar began, "you have heard the news from beyond our walls. You know that we stand alone, that no relief will come, that the odds against us grow longer with each passing day. Some of you may be wondering why we continue this fight, why we do not simply open the gates and accept whatever mercy the Franks might offer." The king paused, his eyes moving along the line of defenders, meeting each man's gaze in turn. "I will tell you why. Because there are some things more precious than life, some principles more important than survival. Because our ancestors did not carve this kingdom from the wilderness, so that we might surrender it at the first sign of hardship. Because the children who come after us deserve to inherit something more than the memory of our cowardice." A murmur of approval ran through the ranks, and the good knight could see some of the old fire returning to the defenders' eyes. Words had power, he had learned over the centuries. The right words, spoken at the right moment, could transform despair into determination, could give men the strength to face impossible odds. "We may die here," Godomar continued, his voice growing stronger. "We may fall with these ancient stones, may be buried beneath the rubble of our walls. But if we do, we will die as free men, as Burgundians, as warriors who chose honor over safety. And that choice, my friends, is one that no enemy can take from us, no matter how many armies they bring against our gates." The speech had its intended effect, at least temporarily. The defenders returned to their posts with renewed purpose, their backs a little straighter, their grips a little firmer on their weapons. But the good knight knew that words alone would not sustain them indefinitely. Morale was like a fire. It needed constant fuel to keep burning, and that fuel was growing scarce in the besieged city. The next morning brought a new horror, the first cases of disease among the defenders. It started with a few men complaining of fever and weakness, symptoms that might have been dismissed as simple exhaustion under normal circumstances. But the good knight recognized the signs, had seen them too many times before in too many besieged cities. Typhus, the camp fever that thrived in conditions of overcrowding and poor sanitation, had found its way inside the walls of Autumn. The disease spread with terrifying speed, striking down strong warriors and weak civilians alike. Within days, nearly a tenth of the defenders were too sick to stand, let alone fight. The good knight watched helplessly as men who had survived weeks of combat succumbed to an enemy they could not see, could not fight with sword or spear. King Godomar himself fell ill on the 7th day of the outbreak, his face flushed with fever, his hands shaking as he tried to maintain his royal duties. The good knight found him in the basilica, slumped over a map table, struggling to focus on the defensive plans that had become increasingly academic as the garrison dwindled. "My lord," the good knight said gently. You should rest. Let others handle the details for now. Godimer looked up with eyes that burned with more than fever. Rest? How can I rest when my people are dying? How can I sleep when the walls are crumbling and the enemy grows stronger each day? It was the cry of a man who felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, who blamed himself for every death, every defeat, every moment of suffering endured by his subjects. The good knight had seen it before in other kings, other leaders who carried burdens too heavy for mortal men to bear. You have done all that honor requires, the good knight said quietly. No man could have done more. Have I? Godimer asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Or have I condemned my people to death for the sake of my own pride? Perhaps Marcus was right. Perhaps it would have been better to surrender at the beginning, to save lives rather than spend them on a hopeless cause. The good knight considered his answer carefully. He had served many kings, had seen them face similar moments of doubt and despair. Some had broken under the pressure, had made decisions they would regret for the rest of their lives. Others had found the strength to continue, to see their duty through to the end, regardless of the cost. My lord, he said finally, there are no easy answers to such questions. But I have learned this in my long years of war. A man can only be judged by the choices he makes with the knowledge he has at the time. You chose to defend your people's freedom. That choice may lead to tragedy, but it is not a dishonorable one. Godimer nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Thank you, my friend. Your words, they help. But the good knight could see that the king was failing, that the combination of disease, exhaustion, and despair was taking its toll. How much longer could the defense continue with its leader weakened, its garrison decimated, its walls crumbling under the relentless bombardment? The answer came sooner than expected, in the form of another Frankish assault that began just before dawn on a day when the mist hung so thick that visibility was reduced to mere yards. The good knight was on the eastern wall when the attack began, the sound of thousands of feet splashing through the muddy approaches barely audible above the constant pounding of the siege engines. This time, the Franks came with everything they had: ladders, towers, rams, and a determination born of weeks of frustration. They had learned from their previous failures, had studied the weaknesses in the wall, had timed their assault to coincide with the defenders' lowest ebb. The good knight could see immediately that this was not another probing attack, but the final push that would determine the fate of autumn. The battle that followed would be remembered, by those few who survived to remember anything, as the bloodiest day in the long history of the ancient city. The Silver Knight stood at the center of it all, his blade flashing in the gray dawn light, his armor running red with the blood of enemies and friends alike. The walls of autumn were about to face their ultimate test. The mist that shrouded autumn on that gray dawn seemed to muffle not just sound, but hope itself. The good knight stood at his post on the eastern wall, his silver armor dulled by weeks of combat, his sword heavy in his hand. Around him, the surviving defenders took their positions with the mechanical movements of men who had long since passed beyond fear into a realm of pure, desperate determination. The Frankish assault began not with the usual war cries and trumpet calls, but with an eerie silence that was somehow more terrifying than any amount of noise. Through the mist came the sound of thousands of feet moving in unison, the creak of siege towers rolling forward on wooden wheels, the splash of boots in the muddy approaches that had been churned by weeks of bombardment. The GoodKnight could see shapes moving in the grey dawn, tall shadows that resolved themselves into siege towers, dark masses that became columns of warriors, the glint of steel that marked the advance of the Frankish army. This was not another probing attack or limited assault. This was the final push, the moment when Kings Childebert and Clothar would commit everything they had to breaking the walls of Autumn. "Archers!" The GoodKnight called out, his voice carrying along the wall. "Wait for my signal." The Burgundian bowmen, fewer now than they had been at the siege's beginning, knocked their arrows and drew their strings. Many of them were sick men, warriors who should have been in their beds but who had dragged themselves to the walls for this final battle. Their hands shook with fever, their eyes burned with more than just determination, but they held their positions with the stubborn courage that had characterized the defense from the beginning. The first siege tower emerged from the mist like a wooden mountain, its sides bristling with shields and spear points. The GoodKnight could see Frankish warriors crowded on its platforms, their faces grim with purpose. Behind it came another tower, and another, until 5 of the massive engines were rolling toward different sections of the wall. The Franks had learned from their previous failures. They would not concentrate their attack on a single point, but would spread the defenders thin by striking everywhere at once. "Now!" the GoodKnight shouted, and the air filled with the whistle of arrows. The Burgundian shafts struck the siege towers like deadly rain, but the Frankish engineers had learned their lessons well. The towers were protected by thick wooden shields and wet hides that turned aside most of the arrows. A few enemy warriors fell, their bodies tumbling from the platforms to the muddy ground below, but the towers continued their inexorable advance. The bombardment from the Frankish siege engines had intensified, stones flying through the mist to crash against the already weakened walls. The GoodKnight felt the ancient masonry shudder beneath his feet as a particularly large boulder struck the wall just below his position. Dust and debris cascaded down into the courtyard, where the few remaining reserves waited with the pale faces of men who knew they were about to die. The first siege tower reached the wall near the main gate, its drawbridge crashing down onto the battlements with a sound like thunder. Frankish warriors poured across the narrow span, their shields locked together, their spears thrust forward in a bristling hedge of steel. The GoodKnight was there to meet them, his silver blade cutting down the first enemy warrior to set foot on the wall. The battle that followed was unlike anything the GoodKnight had experienced in his long centuries of war. It was not the clash of armies in open field, nor the desperate defense of a breach in the wall. It was something more primal, more savage. The final struggle of men who knew that defeat meant not just death, but the end of everything they had ever valued. The Frankish warriors fought with the confidence of men who could see victory within their grasp. They came in waves, each group of attackers pushing a little further along the wall before being cut down by the desperate defenders. The good knight moved like a silver ghost among the combatants, his blade weaving patterns of death in the grey morning light. But for every enemy he killed, 2 more seemed to take their place. To his left, he could see another siege tower disgorging its cargo of warriors onto the wall. The defenders in that section were already wavering, their line beginning to bend under the pressure of superior numbers. To his right, a 3rd tower had reached the wall, and Frankish warriors were establishing a foothold that grew larger with each passing moment. The good knight realized with cold clarity that the wall was lost. The mathematics of siege warfare, which he had understood from the beginning, were finally playing out to their inevitable conclusion. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted by weeks of constant fighting. They had held longer than anyone had a right to expect, but human endurance had its limits. A Frankish spear thrust caught him in the shoulder, sliding between the plates of his armor to draw blood. The good knight spun and cut down his attacker, but he could feel his strength beginning to ebb. Around him, the sounds of battle were changing. Fewer war cries from the defenders, more shouts of triumph from the attackers. The wall was falling, section by section, as the Frankish warriors carved out larger and larger footholds. It was then that King Godomar appeared on the wall, his face flushed with fever, but his sword steady in his hand. The sight of their king fighting beside them galvanized the remaining defenders, and for a moment the Frankish advance slowed. But it was too little, too late. The enemy had too many men, too many advantages, too much momentum to be stopped by one last gesture of defiance. The good knight fought his way to the king's side, his blade clearing a small space around the royal standard. "My lord," he said, his voice barely audible above the clash of steel. "The wall is lost. We must fall back to the inner defenses." Godomar nodded grimly, understanding what this meant. The inner defenses were little more than hastily built barricades in the streets of the city. They might delay the Frankish advance for a few hours, but they could not stop it. The fall of the wall meant the fall of autumn. It was only a matter of time now. "Sound the retreat," Godomar ordered, his voice heavy with the weight of defeat. The horn call that signaled the withdrawal was one of the saddest sounds the good knight had ever heard. It spoke of courage unrewarded, of sacrifice unrecognized, of a cause that had been just but not strong enough to prevail. The surviving defenders began to fall back from the wall, fighting a desperate rearguard action as they retreated through the narrow streets of the city. The good knight was among the last to leave the wall, his silver armor now stained with blood and grime, his sword notched from hours of combat. As he looked back at the ancient fortifications that had protected Autumn for 3 centuries, he could see Frankish banners being raised on the battlements. The wall that had seemed so strong, so permanent, was now in enemy hands. The retreat through the city was a nightmare of narrow streets and desperate fighting. The Franks poured through the breached defenses like water through a broken dam, their war cries echoing off the stone buildings as they pursued the fleeing defenders. The good knight found himself fighting alongside men he had known for weeks, watching them fall one by one as the Frankish tide swept through the ancient streets. The final stand took place in the old Roman Forum, where King Godemar had addressed his people at the beginning of the siege. The surviving defenders, perhaps 200 men out of the 3,000 who had manned the walls, formed a rough circle around their king, their shields locked together in a final gesture of defiance. The Franks surrounded them slowly, methodically, their own shields forming an unbreakable ring of steel. The good knight could see the Frankish commanders studying the situation, calculating the cost of a final assault against the remaining defenders. They had won the city, had achieved their objective. There was no need for unnecessary bloodshed now. A Frankish herald stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Godemar, king of the Burgundians, your city has fallen, your walls are breached, your cause is lost. Surrender now, and your remaining men will be spared. Continue this hopeless fight, and all will die." The good knight looked at his king, seeing in Godemar's face the terrible burden of command in its final moments. The king's fever-bright eyes moved from face to face among his surviving warriors, men who had followed him through weeks of hell and were prepared to die with him if he asked it of them. "My friends," Godemar said quietly, his voice somehow carrying to every man in the circle, "we have fought well. We have held these walls longer than anyone thought possible. We have shown the world that Burgundians do not yield easily to conquest. But the time for fighting is over. The time for dying uselessly has passed." The king stepped forward, his sword held loosely in his hand. For a moment, the good knight thought he might make one final charge, might choose death over surrender. But instead, Godemar reversed his grip on the weapon and let it fall to the stones with a ringing clatter that seemed to echo through the entire city. "I surrender," he said simply. "I yield myself and my remaining men to the mercy of the Frankish kings." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of Frankish warriors securing the rest of the city. The good knight felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, which had been broken too many times to count, but something deeper. The knowledge that another kingdom had fallen, another people had lost their freedom, another chapter in the long story of human struggle had come to its end. The Frankish commanders were professional in their victory, accepting the surrender with dignity and ordering their men to treat the prisoners with respect. The surviving defenders were disarmed but not harmed, their wounds tended by Frankish physicians who understood that mercy in victory was often more valuable than cruelty. The good knight was among the last to lay down his weapons, his silver sword joining the growing pile of Burgundian steel in the center of the forum. As he removed his helmet, he felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon him. All the battles he had fought, all the causes he had served, all the kingdoms he had seen rise and fall. A Frankish officer approached him, clearly impressed by the silver armor and the obvious skill of its wearer. "You fought well, knight. What is your name?" The good knight considered the question for a moment. Names were temporary things, tied to specific times and places. He had worn many names over the centuries, had served under many banners, had been called by many titles. But in the end, he was simply what he had always been, a warrior who stood with the brave against impossible odds. "I am the GoodKnight," he said simply. The officer nodded, accepting the answer without question. In an age when men often took names that described their deeds or their nature, it was not unusual for a warrior to be known by his reputation rather than his birth. As the sun set over the conquered city of Autumn, the GoodKnight stood among the other prisoners and watched as Frankish banners were raised over the ancient walls. The siege was over, the city had fallen, and the kingdom of Burgundy was one step closer to its final extinction. But the Silver Knight had survived, as he always did, ready to fight again in some future battle, for some future cause. The walls of Autumn had fallen, but the spirit they had defended would endure. Somewhere, somehow, the struggle for freedom would continue, and when it did, the GoodKnight would be there, his silver armor gleaming, his sword sharp, his heart prepared for whatever fate the gods of war might decree. The siege of Autumn was over. The legend of the GoodKnight would continue. Chapter 7. The Silver Memory. The morning after the fall of Autumn dawned clear and cold. The mist that had shrouded the final battle burned away by a sun that seemed almost mockingly bright. The GoodKnight stood in the courtyard of what had once been King Godomar's palace, now serving as a temporary prison for the captured defenders. His silver armor had been returned to him, a gesture of respect from the Frankish commanders, who recognized the quality of his craftsmanship and the skill with which he had wielded his weapons. Around him, the surviving defenders sat in small groups, their faces bearing the hollow look of men who had given everything and found it not quite enough. Some nursed wounds that would heal, others bore injuries that would mark them for life. All carried the invisible scars that came from witnessing the death of a kingdom, the end of a way of life that had endured for more than a century. King Godomar sat apart from the others, his back straight despite the fever that still burned in his eyes. The Frankish kings had treated him with the courtesy due to a defeated but honorable enemy, providing him with clean clothes and medical attention. But the GoodKnight could see that something had broken in the man. Not his courage, which remained intact, but his sense of purpose. A king without a kingdom was a tragic figure, a man whose very identity had been stripped away by the fortunes of war. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew the GoodKnight's attention to the courtyard entrance, where a small procession was making its way through the debris-strewn streets. At its head rode two men whose bearing and rich clothing marked them as the victorious Frankish kings, Childebert I of Paris and Clotaire I of Soissons. They came not as conquerors gloating over their victory, but as professional rulers who understood that the business of war was only the beginning of the more complex task of governance. The brothers dismounted and approached the group of prisoners, their eyes moving from face to face until they settled on King Godomar. The GoodKnight watched this meeting of kings with the detached interest of one who had witnessed many such scenes over the centuries. There was a ritual quality to these encounters, a formal dance of victor and vanquished that had been performed countless times throughout history. Childebert, the elder of the two brothers, stepped forward first. He was a man in his prime, with the confident bearing of one who had never known defeat. His armor was magnificent, worked with gold and silver in patterns that spoke of wealth and power, But his eyes, the good knight noted, were not cruel. They held the calculating intelligence of a ruler who understood that mercy could be as effective a tool as the sword. "Godemar of Burgundy," Childebert said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "You have fought with honor and courage. Your defense of this city will be remembered long after the stones of these walls have crumbled to dust." Godemar rose slowly, his movements careful but dignified. "Your Majesty is gracious in victory. I ask only that you show mercy to my people, who have suffered enough for my decisions. Your people will be treated fairly." Clothar interjected, stepping up beside his brother. Where Childebert was tall and elegant, Clothar was shorter and more solidly built, with the scarred hands of a man who had done his share of fighting. "Those who swear fealty to the Frankish crown will find places in our kingdom. Those who wish to leave may do so with safe passage." It was a generous offer by the standards of the age, and the good knight could see the relief in the faces of the surviving defenders. They had expected death or slavery, the usual fate of those who resisted Frankish expansion. Instead, they were being offered a chance to rebuild their lives under new masters. But the good knight also understood the political calculation behind this mercy. The Franks were not just conquerors, they were empire builders, and empires were built as much through assimilation as through conquest. By treating the defeated Burgundians with respect, by offering them a place in the new order, the Frankish kings were ensuring that their victory would be lasting rather than temporary. "And what of me?" Godemar asked quietly. The two brothers exchanged a glance, and the good knight could see that they had already discussed this question. Childebert spoke first, his words carefully chosen. "You will come with us to Paris as our honored guest. You will have lands, a place at court, the respect due to a king who chose honor over expedience. Your bloodline will continue. Your name will be remembered with dignity." It was the same offer that had been made before the siege began, but now it carried a different weight. Then it had been a choice between freedom and comfortable captivity. Now it was simply the terms of surrender, the price of survival in a world where Burgundian independence was no longer possible. Godemar nodded slowly, accepting what could not be changed. "I am grateful for your mercy, your majesties. I pray that history will judge us all with kindness." The formal business concluded, the Frankish kings turned their attention to the other prisoners. The good knight found himself the subject of their scrutiny, his silver armor marking him as someone of importance despite his lack of royal blood. "You are the one they call the good knight," Childebert said, and it was not a question. "Our commanders speak highly of your skill and courage. You fought like 10 men on the walls." The good knight inclined his head slightly. "I did my duty, your majesty, nothing more." "Your duty to a lost cause," Clothar observed, but there was no mockery in his voice. "Yet you fought to the end, even when the outcome was certain. That speaks well of your character. A man must stand for something," the good knight replied simply. "Otherwise, what is the point of standing at all?" The brothers smiled at this, recognizing the philosophy of a professional warrior. They had need of such men in their expanding kingdom, soldiers who understood duty and honor, who could be trusted to serve faithfully regardless of the political winds. "We offer you service in our armies," Childebert said. "Your skills would be valued, your experience welcomed. The Frankish kingdom has need of knights who understand the true meaning of loyalty." It was an offer that many would have accepted eagerly, a chance to serve powerful kings, to fight in successful armies, to be on the winning side for once. But the GoodKnight had learned long ago that victory and defeat were temporary things, that kingdoms rose and fell with the regularity of seasons. His loyalty was not to any particular crown, but to something deeper and more enduring. "I am honored by your offer, your majesties," he said carefully, "but I must respectfully decline. My path lies elsewhere." The kings accepted his refusal with good grace, understanding that some men could not be bought or coerced, only respected. They made arrangements for his release, along with the other prisoners who chose not to enter Frankish service, providing safe passage and a small purse of silver coins to ease his journey. As the day wore on, the GoodKnight found himself walking through the streets of conquered autumn, observing the changes that victory had brought. Frankish soldiers patrolled the ancient thoroughfares, their presence a reminder of the new order that was taking shape. But life was already beginning to return to normal. Merchants reopening their shops, craftsmen returning to their trades, children playing in the squares where battles had raged just days before. The resilience of ordinary people never ceased to amaze him. Kingdoms might fall, armies might clash, kings might rise and fall, but the fundamental business of human existence continued. People adapted, survived, found ways to make the best of whatever circumstances they faced. It was perhaps the most hopeful thing about the human condition, this ability to endure, to rebuild, to find meaning even in the midst of loss. He made his way to the eastern wall, where the breach made by Frankish siege engines gaped like a wound in the ancient stonework. Workmen were already beginning the process of repair, following orders from their new masters to restore the fortifications. The walls would be rebuilt, stronger than before, but they would serve Frankish interests now, rather than Burgundian independence. Standing among the rubble, the GoodKnight reflected on the siege that had just ended. It had been a small conflict by the standards of history, a minor episode in the larger story of Frankish expansion. But for those who had lived through it, who had fought and died on these walls, it had been the most important thing in the world. Every siege was like that, simultaneously insignificant and all-consuming, a footnote in the grand narrative of history and the defining moment of individual lives. He thought of the men who had fallen during the long weeks of fighting, brave warriors who had given their lives for a cause they believed in, even when that cause seemed hopeless. Their names would be forgotten by history, their deeds unrecorded in the chronicles of kings and kingdoms. But they had mattered, had made a difference in ways both large and small. They had shown that courage existed, that honor was real, that some things were worth dying for even when victory was impossible. As the sun began to set over the conquered city, the GoodKnight made his way to the small shrine of Saint Martin that was built into the southern wall. The carved face of the saint looked out over autumn with the same expression of serene compassion it had worn throughout the siege, unchanged by the violence that had swirled around it. The good knight knelt before the shrine, not in prayer, but in remembrance. He thought of King Godomar, who had chosen honor over safety, and would now live out his days as a pensioner of his former enemies. He thought of the defenders who had died on the walls, their blood soaked into stones that had witnessed centuries of human struggle. He thought of the citizens who had endured weeks of hunger and fear, who would now have to learn to live under foreign rule. All of it would fade in time, he knew. The pain would heal, the memories would dim, the very stones would crumble and be replaced by newer construction. But something would remain, the knowledge that when the test came, when everything was at stake, there had been men willing to stand and fight for what they believed in. That knowledge was worth preserving, worth carrying forward into whatever battles lay ahead. Rising from his knees, the good knight adjusted his silver armor and checked his weapons. Tomorrow he would leave Autumn, would take the road that led away from this conquered city toward whatever destiny awaited him. There would be other battles, other causes, other walls to defend against impossible odds. It was his fate, his burden, his purpose, to stand with the brave against the darkness, to fight for the light even when it seemed certain to be extinguished. The siege of Autumn was over, but the war between freedom and tyranny, between hope and despair, between courage and cowardice, would continue as long as human hearts beat in mortal chests. And when it did, the good knight would be there, his silver armor gleaming in whatever light remained, his sword sharp and ready, his spirit unbroken by defeat or victory alike. He walked through the gates of Autumn as the last light faded from the western sky, leaving behind a city that would remember him only in whispered stories and half-forgotten legends. But he carried with him something more precious than fame or recognition, the knowledge that he had stood with good men in a just cause, that he had given his all when everything was at stake, that he had remained true to the code that had guided him through centuries of war and peace. The road stretched out before him, dark and uncertain, leading toward horizons he could not see and battles he could not imagine. But the good knight walked it without fear, without regret, without looking back at the walls of Autumn that had fallen despite his best efforts to hold them. Behind him, the conquered city settled into its first night under Frankish rule, its people beginning the long process of adaptation and survival that would define their lives for generations to come. Ahead of him lay the unknown future, full of possibilities both bright and dark, promising new challenges and new opportunities to stand for what was right. The Silver Knight walked on through the darkness, carrying with him the memory of brave men and noble causes, ready to answer whatever call might come. History would remember the fall of Autumn as a minor victory in the Frankish conquest of Burgundy, a small step in the creation of an empire that would dominate Western Europe for centuries. But the good knight would remember it differently, as the place where courage had made its stand against impossible odds, where honor had chosen death over dishonor, where the human spirit had shown its true strength in the face of inevitable defeat. That memory would sustain him through whatever trials lay ahead, would remind him why the fight was worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The siege was over. The legend continued. In the distance, wolves howled in the forests that surrounded the ancient city, their voices carrying a note of wildness that spoke of things that could never be conquered, never be tamed, never be broken by the ambitions of kings or the fortunes of war. The good knight smiled as he heard them, understanding their message. Some things endured, some things survived, some things remained free, no matter how many walls fell or how many kingdoms crumbled into dust. The Silver Knight walked on into the night, carrying that truth with him like a flame that could never be extinguished. Our good knight will return. Subscribe for more.